I am a senior policy attorney at Ujima Inc., the National Center on Violence Against Women in the Black Community. Thank you so much for joining us this evening for our Coffee and Conversation series. We have been doing these for several months now, and we basically spend time talking about different aspects or concerns as it relates to the Black community, in particular Black women, with folks that are out doing the work, thought leaders, and the like. This evening, I'm really excited about the folks we have to talk with us a little bit about what is meant by protect Black women. So sit back, relax, go ahead and grab your coffee, or I'm having tea, and let's get started with some very lively conversation. Please introduce yourselves. We always want you to connect with each other. We are all still quarantining and enduring a pandemic. And so we like to use the chat as an opportunity for you all to connect with each other, network with each other, because we don't have those opportunities as we once did in an inorganic manner. Share your name and where you're listening in from, perhaps the organization that you work with. Let's get started, folks. As I said before, there has been a renewed call within the Black community to protect and show up for Black women following the incidents of violence directed towards Black women, such as the shooting of Megan the Stallion, the murder of Breonna Taylor, and the continued violence experienced by Black queer women, and especially Black trans women. This conversation is going to center around the lived experiences that Black women have had around street harassment, community violence, and accountability, and will offer strategies to develop safe spaces and combat street violence. Let me give you all some ideas or an introduction of the folks that are joining us this evening. Miss Jakendra Trahan is the Executive Director of Collective Action for Safe Spaces. Can I get you to wave for me? Thank you. Jakendra is a fat Black non-binary femme who grew up in Orange, Texas, and has called the DC area home for about 15 years. She began her career working in the DC area educational equity and social justice initiatives in 2005, starting as an AmeriCorps literacy tutor at Garfield Elementary in Southeast DC. Since then, they've worked across a wide range of programs, school districts, and state departments by offering technical assistance, professional development, program implementation and evaluation, strategic planning, and community engagement through a racial justice lens. Jakendra brings her unique background experiences as a survivor who is disabled and formerly housing insecure to CAS initiatives that they fight against gender-based violence, actualizing alternatives to carceral state by implementing community safety, advocating for sex workers and survivors, as well as being accountable for her community of people who are historically marginalized. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. And wow, that was cool to hear my bio. I appreciate you reading it. Thank you. Hey, y'all.
It was cool to read. Mr. Quentin Wilcott, affectionately known as Q, is a leading national and international anti-violence activist and educator. He is one of the U.S. leaders selected by the Novo Foundation to participate in its groundbreaking Move to End Violence initiative, a 10-year program to strengthen the movement to end gender-based violence in the United States. He's also a member of the Renaissance Network Governance Committee. In 2018, Q was selected to serve on the New York City Domestic Violence Task Force Steering Committee and was appointed to the New York City Mental Health Advocacy Group. A hallmark of Quentin's work over the past 22 years has been engaging men and boys as allies and activists in the movement to prevent intimate and gender-based violence. The foundation of Quentin's work is a focus on the intersection of violence, race, class, and gender, and its impact on marginalized community. He is co-founder and chief organizer of the Father's Day Pledge Against Violence, an annual event established in 2010, and it's observed in 50 cities. Quentin has participated in the international anti-violence forums and led trainings in Brazil, Canada, Fiji, France, India, Kenya, St. Martin, South Africa, Switzerland, and Thailand. He's also the co-executive and director of Connect NYC. Thank you so much. Happy to have you with us.
Thanks for having me.
Ms. Walede Moore is the Violence and National Domestic Hotline Training Coordinator. She received a Bachelor of Applied Sociology at Texas State University in 2016. During her tenure at Texas State, she completed 200 hours of co-facilitation in intimate partner violence, gender inequity, healthy relationships, and bystander behaviors with students in secondary education. She obtained her certification of victim advocate for family services, child abuse, and sexual assault, supporting the Hayes Caldwell Women's Center preventative initiatives to end abuse. Moore is currently pursuing a master's degree in the science of organizational development at Abilene Christian University, expecting to graduate in 2021. During this time, the hotline, Moore has participated in collective actions to maintain an organizational environment that embodies anti-oppression, anti-racism, equity, and justice work. She is passionate about issues of social justice and its effects on survivors of abuse. Thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me.
And Ms. Alana Brown, who is the executive director and founder of Safe Sister Circle. She is a public interest and human rights attorney focusing on nonprofit litigation and advocacy for survivors of domestic violence, sexual abuse, human trafficking, as well as at-risk use within the DC area and globally. In 2018, Alana founded the Safe Sister Circle, which provides culturally specific, trauma-informed, and holistic services for Black women survivors of domestic violence and sexual abuse, living primarily but not exclusively in DC, Wards 7 and 8. Alana is also the recipient of DV Leap's 2020 Tip the Scales of Justice Award for making an impact on gender-based violence in the field here in DC. Alana received her BA in Africana Studies from New York University and her Juris Doctor from Georgetown University. Welcome to all of you, and thank you so much for agreeing to participate and chat with us a little bit about what it means to protect Black women. We're gonna go ahead and get started, folks. The first question that I'd like to have you all provide some response to, the statement, "If they don't give you a seat at the table, bring a folding chair," was famously shared by the first Black woman elected to Congress, Ms. Representative Shirley Chisholm. Please share how representation supports the protection of Black women. We could start off with Q.
Oh, okay. Thank you again for inviting me onto this panel with these my esteemed colleagues.
And please provide your pronouns. I don't think I did that when I read your bios.
He, him.
Thank you.
And I think it's a powerful statement, but I would even go further actually than that statement, because a lot of times we include people of color, Black women in particular, are usually I wouldn't say they're not invited to the table, but they're an add-on to the table. Usually, like, typically when we're at a conference, we've all been there, and we have like a survivor speak. It's usually she's the first voice or the last voice, and her voice disappears in between. I think that we need to really kind of step back and include Black women from the very beginning when we're building the table, when we're constructing the chairs, because I think a lot of times, in terms of like representation, having like a Black woman in the conversation from the very beginning and help designing the conversation is going to be crucial to really getting a certain level of accountability and visibility that's necessary, and transparency that's necessary when we have, true representation of, Black women in these leadership roles. And I say this because we're already built in systems that are really not representing us or giving us justice or accountability in terms of our race, class, and gender. So having one person as a representative of so many people, Black women all over the country or all over the world, there's a lot of pressure with that. And there's also an expectation that we have, and not really understanding that if they're being, they're representing us and women in particular as in a system that is so decadent and thick with exclusion. So the idea of, a Black woman representing all of these people for generations and generations to come, we need to really, support them and really kind of, inject them in the very, very beginning of any process of conversation, or when systems are being built and systems already are not representing us. So we have to be very crafty around how do we have someone representing us as a people, and then also supporting them and also holding them accountable with compassion and realizing that they are in a position, or they may not be truly in a position, to transform a very racist or sexist system. So I think representation is critically important. And I'll just finish with this. Like, one example of it in terms of Black male representation was that photo. I think you all remember when Obama was in his office, and a young boy, probably 2 or 3 years old, and Obama bent over and touched his hair. The little boy looked just like Obama, and what that represented to that young boy, to a young person, to see someone that looks like them, literally and figuratively, to see someone in a position of power and what that means to them. So I think for Black girls, seeing Black women in those positions, for Black boys, seeing Black women in those positions, and even for me as a Black male, seeing our sisters in these positions is very, very important. And not just from a visual sense, but like all the work it takes to have them flourish and thrive in an environment like that.
Thank you so much. Alana? Can't hear you.
Sorry, I was on mute.
Same here.
Representation, I think, matters for different reasons. One of the reasons that I started my organization, because there seemed like there was a lack of Black women representation in the domestic violence and sexual assault field in DC. It was mostly made up of mostly white women. I can't say their backgrounds, where they're from, but generally not from the area. But I'm not saying they don't care about the communities or care about the work that they're doing, but very disconnected from the services that they're providing to the survivors. So my organization, we provide legal services to Black women, mainly in Ward 7 and 8 of DC, which are majority Black communities. And I myself am Black, obviously, and then my other attorney is also Black. We feel like that's a very bold statement we're making to the environment that we're working in. We feel like it's telling our clientele that we look like them and we want to help them, and we come from similar backgrounds from them. And I think that it's a relief to a lot of people. I've had some people tell me like things like, oh, I'm so happy to have a sister for an attorney. Or I'm glad to have an attorney that looks like me, understands where I'm coming from. And although I may not be exactly from where they're from, or have the same life circumstances or been a survivor myself, I feel like there is a need for that representation. And I think as a result, the services feel more holistic. The services feel more culturally relevant. The services feel more individualistic to what people are looking for when they're looking for services besides just basic legal services. Now you're on mute.
You would think, as many Zooms as we all have been on at this point, that I would have learned how to unmute myself. Apparently, I'm still learning. Walede, could you please share your thoughts?
Yes, thank you. So I agree with everything y'all just said. And whenever I think about that statement, bring a folding chair, I think that Black women, Black people have been doing this already. Like the Shirley Chisholm ran in 1970, in the 1970s. So this is something that we've been doing long before that, and we've been making space and for like pushing ourselves into rooms, and still we go unheard. And so it's very, I push against the idea of like, oh, we bring a folding chair. I think that we need to be building the systems, and we are. And I appreciate the work that a lot of us here are doing, and a lot of the people who are watching are doing as well. But yeah, I think that we use the vehicles that are afforded to us. I think Black women are the most educated in America and the US. Black women are the leading minority entrepreneurs in the US. We are using the vehicles that are available to us. I also think there's an added layer of whenever we do certain things, it gets co-opted. Um, and that's also very challenging to navigate. I think about the grassroots of the DV field, and a lot of times, like when we were moving towards like wanting support and getting like a criminal justice response, a lot of Black women were like, hey, we don't think that this is the response that we want for DV. And we went unheard. And now we're looking at a system, and now it's 2020 and people are saying defund the police. And what does that look like? And what does that mean had we listened 30 or 40 years ago? And so I think that's the importance of having Black voices, is like us being able to use our different intersectionalities to be able to think about how this is going to impact the overall culture.
Can I get you to step back for just a second and share with folks what you meant by co-opting? I just want to make sure people understand exactly what you mean by that.
Yeah. So I'm a makeup person, so I think about it in the makeup sense of like Rihanna a few years ago came out with 50 shades or all these different shades of makeup, and everybody was like, wow, like thank you, Rihanna. But this was something that Black people and other people were already asking for before. And so Rihanna does it, and now there's all of these brands who they had the opportunity ahead of time to get like ahead of the curve and do this, and they didn't. And so now they're going along and doing it. So basically, I just mean it's somebody who they could have done something before, and now they're just kind of like doing it for clout, or just trying to get more attention. So
thank you. Jakendra, your thoughts?
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much again. It was really great to hear everyone's responses first, because when I hear a question like that, as someone who identifies as an abolitionist, I'm always wanting to offer the perspective of what does the table represent, and what does the table represent when we talk about like how systems like uphold so much violence against Black women and femmes and girls. And so does it mean that we're offering a table that is rooted in harm and violence? And so how do we, Mr. Quentin was saying, Mr. Q was saying, how do we build a new table or a new community? Because when we think about what representation means, it often means that one person, there's, a hierarchy and power associated with it. And power is good when it's power that's rooted in community. And so when we think about representation and how that's important, it's important, but when I think about, a really clear and stark example is the mayor of DC, a Black woman who is currently, sanctioning violence against Black women, Black young folks, and Black people through the police brutality that's been happening in DC. So what does representation mean by a Black woman mayor who is also, enacting different forms of systemic harm? And so when we think about representation, how do we break the norms around hierarchy and say everyone is the expert of their own experiences? How do we bring forth the most marginalized in the groups, the most marginalized of us forward to teach us their stories and tell us their stories and tell us the ways that they want to lead and tell us that the support that they need? And Black women and girls don't often get that, even if they do get invited inside, or, you know, they are maybe, you know, just invested, you know, in upholding a machine. And so I just want to interrogate, you know, the values around representation so that we're sure that even when we do have someone in a position of power, that person isn't replicating the harm of the systems that continue to allow patriarchal violence and state violence to happen.
Thank you so much. Folks, I did want to stop just to remind you, if there we are going to be answering questions at the ends, the panelists, that is, please feel free to drop those questions in the Q&A. We do have folks monitoring the chat. If you can't exactly figure out the Q&A, that often gets confusing for folks, it seems. So again, if there are questions, we are going to be answering them at the end. Drop them, as well as any other resources that you think can contribute to the conversation. Oftentimes, folks are aware of articles, videos, different things that you can share. Please make sure you're using as much, please make sure that you're sharing that information for folks so they can use it in their own work. We're going to transition to the next question. Why is it important to specifically call for the protection of Black women? Is it enough just to say, you know, Black Lives Matter? Is Black Lives Matter enough? Why do we have to specifically say or protect Black women? Alana?
Come on, you're gonna call me first this time. I am ready. And my pronouns are she, her, and hers. Because I got to say that earlier.
I know you were born ready.
Okay. So I think that it doesn't, because unfortunately, when you hear the Black Lives Matter movement, you think of Black men before you think of Black women, and it kind of overshadows Black women's experience. I think it goes back to the 60s during the Black Power movement. It mostly focused on Black men, or Black women were left behind from that and left behind from the white women feminist movement. So we're kind of just often left behind. So I think we need to uplift ourselves and bring attention to ourselves, that our lives matter, not just to the community, to our community, to the society as a whole, but to ourselves. To let ourselves know that we matter. There's so many esteem issues within domestic violence and sexual abuse. People feel like they don't matter. A lot of Black women feel like they don't matter, but society tells them they don't matter. So I think just uplifting the idea that that Black women specifically do matter, and that it's not just a generic term, that Black lives does not encompass everyone. It encompasses some people. But we want to be specific about what we're talking about. We're not talking about women of color. We're talking about Black women. And their lives are the ones that, you know, are important in our view of trying to like protect and keep them safe.
Thank you. Q? Got your mute.
This is like my 7th call and I forgot to mute already, right? So I think Alana's correct. You know what I mean? You know, Malcolm X said that Black women are most disrespected and oppressed people on the planet, you know, and I think, you know, this idea of protect, you know, when you say protect Black women, we always kind of fall into, you know, how we're socialized to be men and women, you know, particularly, you know, this gender binary that kind of says that, you know, it's Black men or men's role and responsibility to protect Black women. But I would say, you know, we got to challenge that and what that really means. And also, I've never been more protected than by anyone than a Black woman, you know, from my Black mother to my Black great-grandmother to my Black grandmother to the Black, you know, women in my life. So I think, you know, in terms of that statement, and when men are concerned, and in my work around engaging men and boys to be allies with women, also to take leadership from women and stand with and stand for women, because Black women stand for us and protect us, you're probably self-sacrificing more than they do themselves. So I think to really kind of unpack that and break down that what that statement means. And of course, we need to protect women. Our struggles are inextricably linked to Black women. So I think part of what happens is that we are separated. You know, we are separated, like Alana mentioned. I'm part of a process that talks about who is the last person, the most marginalized person on this planet. Like from my experience and who I work with and who I'm most concerned about, that would be a Black woman, right? And if we break that down even further, who is that Black woman? Are we talking about trans woman and we talking about a trans girl, like who is the person most marginalized in our society, in our work, in our movement work. So I think it's important that we lift the idea of, yes, we need to protect Black women as they protect us. We need to protect each other as a race. And I think what Alana mentioned when you talk about race and gender, when we talk about gender, we're talking about women primarily, but that's what ends up the conversation being about. And then when we talk about race, we're typically talking about men of color and Black men. And so sometimes when we talk about racism, we exclude or don't include the idea that Black women are being oppressed and suppressed and attacked by systems as much as we are as Black men. We'll get a lot more attention around it, but Black women are unconditional around who they stand up with and stand for and on the front lines around. And sometimes men were conditional about it. We'll get around this young brother who was shot, but not necessarily the sister who was harmed in the same way. So we have to kind of work on that, looking at this idea of protection in terms of our roles and responsibility as in terms of this gender binary, and expand that we need to really kind of protect ourselves. I think we protect ourselves first, because we may not represent, like Lana mentioned, all the other oppressed peoples, and we have to break that down too as well. But I think this idea of protection is necessary because it is reciprocal.
Thank you. Jakendria?
Yes. Do you mind repeating the question too, just so I...
Not a problem. Why is it important? What does it mean to protect? Sorry, I'm stumbling. Why is it important to specifically call for the protection of Black women? Isn't Black Lives Matter enough? Why is it important to specifically indicate that Black women are included in those Black lives?
Absolutely. Yes. Thank you for repeating. And one thing I wanted to note that wasn't included in my bio is that I'm also a part of an organization called Black Youth Project 100, which is a young organization of young Black 18 and 35-year-olds across the country, organizing through a Black queer feminist lens. And we've had campaigns like the Say Her Name campaign and the current She's Safe, We Safe campaign that's happening. And so a lot of examples come to mind because we've been working on these issues and thinking about, the maternal health crisis, thinking about, Black girls in schools who are suspended at higher rates, the sexual assault by police officers are mostly against Black women and trans women and Black LGBTQ folks. There's, the list goes on. Black trans women's life expectancy is 35. And they also are, we can see on film, today, attacks on Black trans women in the streets where people watch. And so, the issue, is so specific because, like others are saying, we have been the most disregarded, those who are Black women and femme folks, and thinking about how protection, how criminalization often comes into play, and the psyche and like the logic around how others can see, someone who's lighter skinned or a white woman, or, someone who is not a Black woman as more innocent or more deserving of protection, and are, when we think about the Black women who are in jail right now because they're domestic violence survivors, because they were attacking, and thinking about Centoya Brown and Crystal Kaiser, and how, they didn't have that protection. And once they stood up for themselves, they were criminalized. And so just thinking about the ways that patriarchal violence is seeped into our systems, seeped into our families and our relationships. And we all have to actually uproot and think about how we all kind of buy into patriarchal violence on a day-to-day basis. It's not just a man problem. Like Mr. Q said, it's not just a binary issue. It's an issue that we all actually have to look inside of ourselves and see, how am I upholding this every day? How am I making sure that I know, who in my neighborhood, or who in the schools or in the organizations that I'm working with, where the, most marginalized, do I know their voice? Do I know their name? And how do I know if they need any support? Do they know that they can come to me for support? And so, yeah, I just didn't want to start listing everything, but there's just so many, reasons why Black women and girls and femme folks need more support, more care, and more protection.
Thank you. Walede?
All right. Yeah. I think the simple answer to this is just because we deserve to have protection. I don't think anything, if we see a child being harmed, we want to protect that child. And so it's very challenging whenever it's just kind of to think that like people are like, well, why does this need to happen? Because it just should happen. But to go off of what a lot of y'all have been saying, like we're one of the most marginalized groups. And then when we start talking about different intersectionalities, then that even gets even, it just like compounds on itself. And so when I think about it, it's crazy because I think about the way that we think about value in our society. And even then, I'm still like, to me, I'm still like, Black women are invaluable. I think about Marsha P. Johnson, Katherine Johnson, Maya Angelou, Audre Lorde, Nina Simone. And when I think about all of the different realms that they're navigating, whether that be politically, in the music industry, at NASA, all these different things where Black women kind of had to fend for themselves in these situations where it would have been, we could have advanced in certain areas a lot of like a way faster. And when I say we, I mean as a society, I don't mean just as Black people, could have advanced much faster if we listened and protected Black women. I also think that when I think about all of this, it continues to show the importance of what we're doing, but like it shows that Black Lives Matter, the movement can't be the only thing that we're looking to protect us, because it has to be just different areas. It has to be, all right, some people are over here talking about the prison complex and what's going on over there. And some people are talking about the political aspects of stuff and what's happening over there. Some people are addressing schools. And I think it's just gonna take people kind of having that passion in all these different areas and then addressing it slowly. But it can't be just one movement for one, like to resolve everything. But yeah, hopefully that answers the question.
Thank you so much. We're going to pivot just a second. We did have a comment related to this question, so I did want us to address it as we're speaking in real time. So it says, since Black Lives Matter was founded by 3 women, isn't it obvious that Black women were included in the Black Lives Matter movement? Any thoughts about that?
I don't know that everyone knows the Black Lives. I'm sorry.
Please go ahead, Alana. We can take another. Sure, go ahead, Alana.
I don't think everyone knows that Black Lives Matter was started by 3 Black women. I don't think that's necessarily common knowledge. I think that's not common knowledge because there's as I said before, there's not a focus on Black women within the Black movement. There's a focus more on men. As Q had said earlier, when there's a brother shot, the people rally against that person. When a Black woman shot, less likely to do so. So Black Lives Matter first came out, it was focusing solely on mostly the men victims and not so much on the female victims of community violence and domestic violence, sexual abuse. So I don't think it's obvious. I also think that when we look at domestic violence and sexual violence in our own communities, it's Black men hurting Black women. Sometimes people don't want to talk about that or think about that. And so even within the Black community, that Black lives matter, some lives matter less than others, and that women's lives seem to matter less than Black men's lives and are devalued because of that. So I don't think it's obvious that Black Lives Matter means it includes Black women. I think that might be a given for some people, but not for me.
Thanks so much. Jakendria?
Yeah, I was just going to share that. So BYP 100, I've been a part of it for almost 6 years. BYP 100 was founded at around literally the same time as Black Lives Matter. And in the Black Lives Matter movement, the 3 women that you're referring to did form the organization around, well, the start was Michael Brown. And so I think that what would be I think what's helpful to know is that once you start a campaign and a movement around, this central core thing, and the way that the media works and the way that when things get widespread, it works. I would say that it's easier for a lot of folks to think about, Black men, because again, how patriarchy shows up, and misogynoir, shows up. But I also feel, like it's important to just like offer some history and perspective. When the first movement for Black Lives convening happened in 2015, this was shortly after Michael Brown was killed, Trayvon Martin was killed, and people were forming organizations. We had a national convening in Cleveland, Ohio. And at that time, there was a lot of inner turmoil because there were trans folks that were there. There were abolitionists that were there. This is the first time in a long time that, many groups of Black people and organizations came together. And so a lot of folks, including the founders, including other leaders of the organization, realized in that moment how intersectional, we needed to make the movement. And so I think from there, the movement for Black Lives platform, that happened as a result. And then that's kind of, people call it Black Lives Matter, but like folks who are actually organizing call it the movement for Black Lives, because BLM is such a hashtag, again, like mainstream media, you lose it, it waters down, the perspective. And so I would say the folks who are on the ground, including the 3 Black women who started, have really made it known like that they mean all Black lives.
Thank you. Q, you were gonna jump in?
I just wanted to add on to that, because I think that was perfect, kind of giving the history and what typically happens with movements, especially nowadays because of social media and how the media's role in portraying and telling the story, quote unquote, the story of the issue, and also those that are organizing it, is that, that the media ends up selecting our leaders for us. Like 3 women started movement for Black Lives, but then when it needed to be talked about on CNN or other media stations, they plucked out, men that were part of the movement, not necessarily founders of the movement. It kind of, and what that typically does is kind of creates, factions within, and, this nature. And I think that just goes back to the previous questions around how do we protect Black women leadership? How do we ally with? How do we take leadership from, Black women in movement spaces as well? Because, if we don't kind of figure it out, media decides who our leaders are. And I think that's part of the problem. And that's also a systemic form of, violence or misogynoir, when Black women are at the center or leadership of anything, they'll try to usurp it and trying to create factions externally. So that's why it's important that we have these conversations and really having an internal conversation around, how do we protect Black women from that and protect the movement from, the external forces trying to, break us up and separate us. I think that, again, harping on the idea of separating in terms of Black people, separating Black women from Black men and other, and Latino folks too. Like leadership is separated all the time around gender, and we just kind of lose our minds around that. So we have to kind of be prepared and not allow our leaders to be decided from someone else.
Thank you so much for your thoughts. Just wanted to let you all know that there are articles being shared and video footage being shared in the chat box. Jakendria just sent a link to the organization that she named that she mentioned was not read in her bio. So I'm glad that you all will be learning a little bit more about some of the other work that she's doing. We're gonna move on to the next question, but I didn't want to miss that moment to give these wonderful thought leaders the opportunity to address that very important question. What does it mean to protect Black women? What does it look like? What does it sound like? And what is it? And what should be done? Walede?
Thank you. Yeah. So I feel like it's one of those things where the answer is simple, but then it's very complex. And it's, I think of it similarly to the way that the protections that are offered for anyone else in any situations. Well, mostly white people, white males in certain situations, where it's like the opportunity to make mistakes in life and grow from them. The opportunity I talked about Black women being the most educated, but we're not starting in like most like middle class areas. And if we are, like, we compound so much debt in the process. So like, what does that look like? I think just kind of having a system where we can help people get their footing. And I think a lot of it is like anytime we get our footing, it's one step, it's a knockdown. Or you get into a certain space and you finally think you've made it, and it's like, oh, I'm an executive, and then somebody says, oh, you need to tone it down because you're in this space, or change your hairstyle because you're in this space. So I think it's allowing Black women, Black people to be their authentic selves in the spaces that we occupy. And I don't have like a set clear answer for that, but I just know that it's very simple, but then it's very complex. So that's kind of my short version of that.
Thank you so much. Yeah, you touched on a lot of things that kind of strike a nerve. I actually was going to follow up and say where, but you made it clear when you talked about hair. So we're talking about places like the workplace, places like school, and as we go amongst our comings and goings. So thank you again for making sure to continue to bring that up. I do also like that you bring up the fact that Black women are in fact the most educated demographic in the United States currently. And as you have alluded to several times, that doesn't necessarily lend itself to wealth building for us because of all of the other stumbling blocks that we often have, just like you shared. So again, thank you for those thoughtful words. Alana?
So I think first, in order, what does protection of Black women looks like, we have to kind of see what it does not look like. And I think if you look historically, as an African studies major, I study stuff all the time. It's from a nerdy perspective. We think about abolitionists, talk about the criminal system. It's basically made to protect white women, right, from Black men. And so, and protecting Black white women and putting them on a pedestal, they're the opposite of what Black women are, which are not to be protected, which are not victims. They're Jezebels, they're Hottentots, they like sex, they can't be raped, they can't be abused, they can't be survivors or victims. So I think in order to, we have to acknowledge that Black women have vulnerabilities, that Black women are vulnerable, they're not the strong, Black woman type all the time, that we can be survivors, that we can be abused, and we need help from the community, just like anyone else needs help from their community. And we need support from the community, especially from our brothers, a lot of times, and sisters, because sometimes we bring each other down. I think you just have to look at in terms of, allowing us to be, like I said before, to be victims and allow there to be some choices to live a safe life, the choices to avoid being in danger, the ability to go walk down the street without feeling fear of being harassed by someone or raped by someone if you're not with a man, or the fear of like someone like Breonna Taylor, someone just coming and shooting you in your own bed and just blatantly killing you. And that's just the fear. I think there's just a lot of fear. So to be free of fear, I think, is a big part of it. But also the part about victimhood, I think, is very relevant as well.
Thank you so much. Jakendra?
Yes. So I in like alignment with what everyone has said, and just thinking about, yeah, what does it mean to protect Black women? I feel like we have to, humanize Black women a lot more, and stop thinking about them as like these superhero warriors. The founder of Black Girl Magic, the statement Black Girl Magic even said it herself, that the statement wasn't meant to deify Black women and girls. It was to say that we are human and are surviving a lot amidst in being in this world. And so I feel like, creating a sanctuary for Black women looks like being able to support them and being a home for their vulnerabilities. I think it's really important for people on a one-on-one level to interrogate, do the Black women in your life come to you when they're tired? Do they show their vulnerabilities? Do they show their truest selves? And those ways, you can be able to open up and figure out how to support them. And I think on, systemic levels, it looks like, reparations, and ensuring that criminalization isn't a part of the survivor's process in seeking justice. And that when something does happen, as far as a Black woman being harmed, it doesn't cause a new cycle of harm by her, wanting to seek services. And I just think that, there are ways that organizations, and, groups and businesses and people who are, looking to Black women's leadership should be allowing, especially in this time, Black women to rest. I also feel like, investing in Black women's rest, investing by saying, hey, can I look after your kids? Can I offer a meal to you? Are you good? And then also, offering equal pay, and, benefits and things like that, that are actually going to help, Black women be able to maintain their safety and their sanity in the day to day. But I'll pause there.
Thank you so much. I know you could continue. Q, please share your thoughts on the protection. What does it look like? What does it sound like? Where should it happen?
Yeah, I think it's it's a great question, and to really kind of break it down, it's like, protection from whom, right? Like, and part of the reality is that Black men harm Black women, we have to kind of address that, and deal with that. And I think it's, and really asking the question, like maybe using in a restorative justice way or transformative justice way, like, what is the harm? What does accountability look like? And what does safety look like? And, letting, Black women drive that conversation or drive those answers. And I think we have to kind of address that. And I think it's, and then, and that's why I think it's important. I'm glad to be on this panel. I'm usually on the only male on a lot of these panels and these conversations, but I think it's important that we engage men and boys in this conversation so we know about, how we should be held, how, what accountability looks like and what it is that we're doing, and recognize it, what is unintentional and what is intentional. And even the unintentional things, what harm does that do to the women and girls in our lives? And I think the protection looks like stepping up around, being co-parents, even if we're not together or if we are together, our fatherhood piece, stepping up around, answering that question that I think the sister mentioned in terms of, the Black women being the most educated, and breaking that down. Why is that? Why do they need to be, right? In terms of wealth building, and how men, high school graduate, drop out of high school graduate, has more opportunities for business, building businesses and developing wealth. Of course, it depends on your race, class, and race and class around that in terms of, men being able to kind of do that. But to really participate fully, not even necessarily equally, but mutually, right? And not, and that can mean we're doing 70% of the work in raising our kids and childcare and et cetera, and recognizing and being strategic around how we participate together, but really kind of being driven by what are the needs. And also for men not to be fooled by the idea that we have privilege, we have entitlement, and there's certain levels of expectations, and how we benefit from that construction the way it is, and how, sisters are doing most of the work, taking care of us, holding us accountable, protecting their kids, and trying to be well themselves. And I love the fact that, as Kendra mentioned, this idea that, Black women, I think you all mentioned that Black women are so strong and tough that then, they can't be the typical victim, survivor of violence. But, the fact that they are resilient, but not resiliency in the sense that they're not healing. They're not the fact that you just get up and take the harm again, but like that time and that break around healing. And I think if we heal, then we'll truly be protecting Black women in those ways.
Thank you so much for your response. Appreciate that. In a recent New York Times opinion piece, Megan P., also known as Meg the Stallion, wrote, "It's ridiculous that some people think the simple phrase protect Black women is controversial. Is it a controversial phrase? And if so, why is it?" Walete?
Thank you. Um, this one is definitely it's frustrating again because it's controversial because it is like I don't understand why it would be, but for whatever reason, like protect Black women is controversial, and I think about when everything first happened with Megan the Stallion, it wasn't like we're caring for her. It was more of like, what were the details? Like, I want to know what happened. What did she do to cause this person to act this way? And I think it's um something that we've been touching on a little bit of like um even if something else did happen, which I'm not even gonna go there, but it's just those levels of what is the perfect victim? Like what are we calling the victim? Um in certain situations. So when I think about that, I think about the response to it. And it was a few like couple of days of like people just like having memes and jokes and everything. And then it took for and I'm from Texas. So I think if I remember correctly, it took for, of course now I'm about to forget his name. UGK. Anyways, that's another conversation. Somebody from UGK being like, we need to protect Megan. And then after he said what he said, then all of this flood of males came in and were like, oh yeah, protect Black women. And so even just the slowness of like, I feel like that should have been something that from the beginning of that, like when it happened to her, that should have been something that happened. And so it's just kind of I just saw thank you, Jakendria. But yeah, I think it's definitely a challenge to navigate. And it doesn't seem like it should be um controversial. I think that it goes again, we talk about intersectionalities, we talk about, and like Kimberly Crenshaw talks about and I'm gonna butcher this really but it's gonna like it was like in the workplace they were having troubles, and so Black men complained and saying, oh, we're not getting promoted. Woman complained and said, we're not getting promoted. And then a few years later, Black women came in and were like, hey, we're not getting promoted. And then they looked at the statistics and they're like, well, Black men are getting promoted, white women are getting promoted, y'all are good. And it was kind of like, and I could be butchering this a little bit, but it was like, oh, like it was that forgetting of, yeah, we can address being Black, we can address being woman, but if we don't talk about both intersectionalities and how it's infecting a Black woman, I think that that's one of those things that we need to be able to talk about. And even when we go back to Shirley Chisholm and the work that she was doing back then, it was a lot of, she talks about her intersectionality and being proud of being Black and being proud of being woman, and the struggles that she was facing in that time, and like being unbossed, and all of those different things were coming into play. And so I think it's the refusal to acknowledge the importance of intersectionality. And I think that that's why it's so hard for people. I think it's very similar to when we talk about BLM, why it's like, oh, people automatically go to all lives matter. And it's like, we know that all lives matter. We're talking about the intersection where all lives are not being impacted by police violence in the same way. So when we say Black Lives Matter, we're talking about this intersectionality of brutality that Black people are facing. And even then, it's also needs to be said of like the all Black Lives Matter, because even then we're talking about in the movement where Black men are put on a pedestal, then followed by Black women, Black trans, and then it just trickles down like into all of the different intersectionalities. So I think that that's why it's controversial, because people think if we address Black, if we address being woman, then we've addressed the issue.
Thank you so much. Jakendra, what are your thoughts? Why is it controversial, or is it controversial?
Yes, I think that it is controversial in the context of like the systems, even Meg getting that like platform of the New York Times. It's like, wow, it took a celebrity, to to even, getting shot to even get that platform, and so thinking about, yeah, controversy in the context of a white supremacist, patriarchal, cis heteronormative, and very ableist machine that is social media and media in general. And I feel like what comes to mind as far as what makes Meg the Stallion's situation unique is, this is someone who has like owned her sexual power in her artistry, is someone who is taller in stature, and also, seen as an object by a lot of people. And so what we saw happen is that, a lot of people, hot girl summer is, always a thing, hot girl fall, all these things, her twerking and having her fun with her friends and all that good stuff. Everybody was along for the ride for that. But then once we see this, incident happen, like what Lade said, we see, people victim blaming. We see people making memes and making fun of folks. And I think, again, with I wanted to name like Megan's stature, and, in comparison to the person who shot her, that's a threat, or people, see that as like, you don't feel pain. Like, why are you even back on the internet, celebrating yourself? Like, shouldn't you be laying down, and doing XYZ? So, it's that constant judgment and that constant, disregard for Black women's feelings that makes, this statement so controversial.
Thank you so much. And just for some of the folks that may not have any context, just to let folks know, we did provide you with the op-ed and the link so you could get a better understanding for those that may not have followed this story. But if you could briefly share, just in a couple of sentences, what exactly this particular phenomenon or particular story was.
Yes, I'm sorry about that.
No worries.
So essentially, Megan the Stallion, who is a rapper from Houston, Texas, was out with friends and another very popular singer named Tory Lanez. She was shot in the foot, and there was footage that showed her basically kind of naked and walking with a bloody foot, and I'm sorry, I should have done a trigger warning. But it was very much a spectacle, and this happened last late, I think, last summer. Yeah.
Thanks so much. I just wanted to make sure some of the folks that weren't familiar had an opportunity, and also we have provided some articles in the chat box in case folks would like to take a look at that op-ed. Alana?
The question is it controversial?
Is it controversial? Is it controversial to make the statement, protect Black women? And if it is, why is it? I'm asking that because in her op-ed, she said, it's ridiculous that some people think that the simple phrase, protect Black women, is controversial. So my question is it controversial? And if it is, why is it?
So I think it is controversial. I think it goes to the Black community. I was thinking about this earlier, and someone wrote a question about it in the comments that I just want to address. They said, how do you talk about domestic violence in the Black community without villainizing Black men? And so when you're saying that, Megan the Stallion was a Black woman who was hurt by a Black man, people are quick to rush to the man's side and victim blame the Black woman rather than saying, why was the Black woman being harmed? How is she being harmed? And where's this harm coming from? What's the history and cycle of this harm? I think there's also a lack of understanding how the power dynamics of interpersonal violence works. That even though she's a bigger woman, somehow she can't be hurt. And power dynamics about power, not physical power, but power over someone mentally, emotionally, physically, the power to actually be able to shoot someone. It gives someone a certain power. But so I think it's controversial. People are like, why do Black women need to be protected from Black men? Black men aren't villains. Black men are out here hurting all Black women. Or I went to a meeting one time, I said, 40% of Black women are survivors of domestic violence, sexual abuse. And someone said, well, no, that's not true about Black men. What about people who hurt Black men? And I was just like, that's not what we're talking about right now. I'm not saying like most survivors are probably hurt by the same race of people they're with, but it doesn't mean that most survivors happen to be women of color, and the most survivors of domestic violence happen to be Black women. And people who generally hurt them happen to be Black men. And I'm not saying Black men are villains. I'm just saying that's just a fact. And we need to take that fact, and what do we do with that fact in the community when we go out and we address it? And I think Q's doing a good thing by making boys and men allies. But I do think it's that idea of like, what make Black women so special, or they're making Black men look bad. There's all this conversation on the internet community, like Black women versus Black men, and all this other stuff, which I think is hyped up. I don't think I don't think Black men and Black women are against each other at all. But I just think that people hype up certain conversations to make it sensationalize things.
Thank you for your thoughts. Q?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, and it's terrible we got to spend time on explaining why that's controversial or not. And I think it's the reality. I think what was mentioned, it's the idea that this Black woman has a platform like that. Number two, the whole idea of victim blaming, which was mentioned. I think even in this case, if I remember hearing correctly recently, it was like, okay, she makes this statement, but then we'll wait for Tory Lanez to give us the real story of what happened. I think he made up a story. Now everybody's chasing that, and they blamed her, like many other cases, from R. Kelly to other, entertainers who've harmed the women in their lives. But I think it's also this other level of, when something like that happens, that Black men or the Black community needs to step to the person who did the harm, and that's not happening, right? And we also we're socialized to rely on systems for accountability, and when harm is done to us, to kind of punish someone, et cetera, et cetera. So a lot of it is like in my work, doing work around domestic violence, intimate partner violence. Like I've been on panels many times, and I'm not growing up as a Black male in New York City, my relationship with the police and systems is not unique, right? I'm not favorable. That's not like my first choice is to call the police. But I think most of the times when I speak and I talk about like restorative justice and what that means, and like sisters are protecting men from the systems, even though they're being harmed by these men, they're worried about those men being harmed by the system. So typically sisters are protecting us, right? And we're not reciprocal in a way of stepping to Tory Lanez and saying that was incorrect, you should not have done that, regardless of whatever the issue was. There's other ways of dealing with that conflict. So I think part of it is that, and there's a certain protection. And like for Black people in that community, I know everybody jumped on her, but it was kind of like, if we're not stepping up, there's not an eternal way of holding brothers accountable, anyone accountable, with compassion and holding, keeping someone safe, because that protection piece is connected to a level of safety. If that's not in place, I always say to people who complain about sisters or women of color who call the systems, I always kind of say, I'm not pro systems at all, but like in some cases where it's really critical, that was the last resort that they had, and they had to do that. So I think a lot of it was that, oh, well, you're saying that, and so a lot of it's about the platform that a Black woman of that nature, entertainer or not, if it was not an entertainer and had that platform, it'd probably be even worse in terms of like the pushback and the, just kind of like the hate she got as a result. So I think it's what everybody said, but then also like analysis of these systems and how do they work and who do they benefit? Because likely sister calling the systems on that, she would be held in endangerment of putting her children in endangering her children in neglectful because she was being abused in front of the children, right? So systems play a certain role with people of color and Black women in particular that can control her life eventually, if she calls on a system where she has to go to group, children can be taken away. And, a lot of times these brothers are not held accountable. And that's where my work comes in. Like, how do we hold men accountable with compassion and understanding that, we got to work and have amicable relationships with our women and sisters in our lives.
Thank you so much. Valete, you wanted to you had a follow-up.
To what Alana said, I think that about like the pushback of like whenever you state facts about who harms who, and it being Black women come forward about being abused, and people look towards Black men. There's also a statistic when it comes to white supremacy and how this country was able to push forward. It required the rape and pillage and sexual assault, just so much violence specifically towards Black people and Native American people. So whenever you look at the statistics, it's really funny, is when you look at the statistics, it's the same, it's very similar in the Native American community where they're experiencing high levels of abuse just overall. And it's very similar to the Black community, then followed by other groups such as like the Asians. So that's all I'm adding on. So it's really funny when people are like, oh, well, we're attacking this. We just really need to be discussing how white supremacy has impacted everything. Because for them to be able to get us to do, for us to come, be brought to a country against our will, that whole voyage, and then get here, and then all of the mental effects, all of that, and then that's impacted on how we are now responding and moving through society. So hurt people, and it shows.
Thank you so much. Folks, I'm going to try to weave in some of the audience questions along with some of the panel questions, again, just so they're a little bit more organic. I'd ask that 2 of you answer this particular question, as we are, I don't want to hold folks. I know people have scheduled this time. But the question is, how do we protect ourselves or respond to the ally who wants us to use us to promote their agenda, especially when they belong to another marginalized group? This question is coming from the perspective of an Afro-Latina who has suffered violence from white Latinas. Jakendria, sorry for butchering your name.
Yeah, it's all good. I'm just chuckling because I'm like, you sure you want to know my answer? Because my answer to that, as someone who's done a lot of racial equity work and a lot of, organizing alongside non-Black people, the best thing you could do is just form your own formations and form your own groups and find find your political home in places where people who identify, as the same as you, where you have a common struggle. Because even I just feel like there are just so many limitations, and I feel you, because it's just there are a lot of white folks out there, or not even non-Black folks out there, who are doing this work for Black women, and are trying to do this in service of Black women, but are making mistakes all along the way and causing more harm than good. And so I feel like, unless you need a coin, again, this is why I was like, I don't know if this is appropriate to say, unless you need, the funds or the resources or support, I would say, take that. But I just feel like the exploitation of Black women in the movement, and Black women in general, it seeps into the movement, even when there's a social justice tag on it. And so the ways that I found community and I found home, is, to have a political center with people who are just like me, or who have that common struggle. And then I work across, those lines of differences, when I need to.
Thank you so much. Alana?
I have to be honest, I don't have that personal experience. I generally surround myself with people who look like me. That's how I live my life, throughout my college, law school, adult life.
Sure.
So I can't say anyone is using me as an ally to uplift them. I would say that one of the benefits of my organization, the benefits I think of Jakendra's organization, is that it's a safe space for Black women. It's where people can find a safe space to be their authentic selves. And I think that if you have people who are bringing violence into that space, or make people uncomfortable being their true selves, and being uncomfortable with what they can say in front of, you can say certain things, but you can't say other things. You can say women of color, but you can't say Black women, all this nonsense. If you put that into the mix, it messes up the safe space. So I would just say, get those people out of the space and just say, we're not wanted here. And I'm not against allyship, I'm for allyship, but in terms of certain spaces, it's not necessary. We can hold it down on our own.
Gotcha. Well, at AQ, anything to add?
I would just say, anti-Blackness is important. You can have allies, but if they're not around anti-Blackness, or, anti-racism is one thing, but in particular, anti-Blackness is important. And colorism is real. There's so many privileges around that. And I think, like Jakendria mentioned, if you're not being strategic around that allyship, then you're going to run into these problems and issues, right? Like me, I'm a co-executive director with a white woman, right? So we have a race intersection, we have a gender intersection, and in age as well. So we're really strategic about who's going to be on Front Street on this. And I know that my co-director is about anti-Blackness, and we're always in conversation around that. So I think those conditions have to kind of be in play, and you got to check in with each other. And I think having your own spaces with other Black women or Afro-Latinas. I think she was saying she's Afro-Latina, and she's and her colleague is a white Latina. So there's a lot going on with that. Who takes the lead and who kind of has. And again, like we're talking about here, protection, taking lead. How do we become real allies? How do we stand with and stand for? If it's a depending on the dynamic, who you're working with, it has to be led by that Black woman in those cases. So, but yeah, protecting yourself as well is important if you're not getting around you. And Black women do that all the time, but setting something in play that can talk about that anti-Blackness.
Thank you.
Yeah, lastly, I would just say I agree with a lot of what they're saying. Overall, if you trust that person, if you vet them or whatever, I think it's kind of challenging because they have their own agenda. And what does that look like in reference to what you're trying to do and the work that you're trying to promote? I think that is something to be mindful of, and just be careful of how you're moving. And if you go that route, just kind of be prepared for what might happen, especially if it's not in the same exact community fully.
Thank you. I hope that was helpful to our audience member. So to move on to our next question, Feminista Jones is a social worker and activist that started the hashtag #UOKSIS after she witnessed a woman on the street that was experiencing street harassment. Is street harassment real? Is that a real thing? Is it harmful? And why is it so important to create some awareness around it? It's really interesting. I actually saw I think it's relatively popular video with Amanda Seales, where she's talking to this gentleman about street harassment. They were talking about this ad that was put out, and there was a debate. She was debating this man, and he was essentially saying that street harassment didn't exist. I showed it to my mother a few months back, and she really couldn't believe that was his opinion, and he that he really took the position that these women this was just something fabricated and that it was just made up. And she reflected on times when she had walked past people in her regular comings and goings, and how off-putting it was to have people yell and snicker and ogle and different things, and she kind of wondered what it is that she was doing wrong. And so that's just kind of a personal story, just to kind of share the perception of some as it relates to street harassment, which is something that has occurred, in my personal comings and going. And I just kind of wanted to get your thoughts on what you think. Let's start with Q.
Yeah, I mean, it does exist. It's about male supremacy. Ultimately, it's about what do you do in front of your peers. I participated in it. I grew up in that. This whole idea of it's a rites of passage, and that wasn't about anyone else but the other men in my circle, in my clique. Like I'm proving to them, because again, I was raised by a Black woman who told me you respect Black women multiple ways. But when I got around my peers and other young men and boys, I was in a position to select and slide and felt like, I had to do this in a lot of cases, or it was part of the competitiveness of growing up and being a man. So I participated in that. So I know it exists because I've done it myself, and I've done harm doing that in a lot of ways. I remember being, going to the village when we were younger. The whole competition was who's going to get the most numbers from the women out there. And my thing was, I'm going to get the most no matter what. And, so even participating in that was street harassment, because as they're walking by, you're making a gesture. I always thought I was a little bit more humane, but nevertheless participated in it all the same. And you're talking about body parts, you're whistling, you're objectifying and making, young women your property. And if you get rejected, you call them out of their name and their character. And that was usually done in front of the other guys, in my case. So just to kind of say, I wasn't soft, I wasn't weak, I didn't let, a situation get by. So yes, it does exist. It's wrong, it does harm in many ways. And it's a precursor. I don't like to say precursor a lot of times because the street harassment in itself, depending on a person and their histories around trauma, et cetera, can be as painful as other levels of what street harassment leads to in terms of sexual violence and things of that nature. So I just say all that to say is that, and I participated in it, as growing up through my rites of passage from being a teen into a man. But a lot of times as men, it doesn't stop. It continues and continues and continues.
Alana, does street harassment exist? Is it just something made up? And if it does exist, how is it harmful?
Well, it does exist. I mean, I'm originally from DC, and I remember when I was growing up, I can't remember, I was back in town when I was living in New York, and I was back in town in DC. Someone got killed for like denying someone's number. Like, girl was gonna give guy a number, he came up and shot her and killed her. My mother was like, "Oh God, please give men your number, give them a fake number, do something." When a guy says, "How do you speak to them so they don't kill you?" And just the idea that you have to go around feeling that you're obligated to speak to someone, and you're obligated to do something for somebody else's benefit to stay alive, is the type of violence that street harassment brings into the picture. The fact that you have to go hear people whispering names, calling you names on the street, going things unwanted. I think Greta put in the question, people telling you to smile. It's the fact that someone feels like they have the right to tell you to smile. Who are you to tell me you have a right over me for anything? And it's that same mentality that does lead to sexual violence and domestic violence. The idea that you own someone or you have a right as a man over women to do certain things or to say certain things, and women are just supposed to take it or react to it in a positive way. So I think it is a precursor to like just a whole culture of violence. It's just part of that culture.
Thank you. Jakendra?
Yes, absolutely. I wouldn't be here if it weren't an issue. And that's because collective action for safe spaces, its roots are actually in street harassment prevention. And I'm actually going to pop in a document for those who are, in the DC area. We worked on a legislation called the Street Harassment Prevention Act of 2018. That was the first actual legislation of its kind that kind of outlines, the prevalence of street harassment and the fact that a criminalized approach, because harassment is not a crime in DC, a criminalized approach doesn't work. And so they just did data collection in DC and found, that street harassment is absolutely an issue. It happens to trans and queer folks, disabled folks, homeless folks, the most. Obviously in DC. And so street harassment is very much, is about like sexual, and patriarchy and gender-based violence. And there's also other systemic, elements. There's harassment based on like if you're wearing a religious garb or if you're wearing, wearing something that may be indicating something different, like that your gender expression may be different, or queer. And then there's folks who are in DC who are experiencing homelessness, who are harassed by people who are gentrifiers or by the police or business owners. And so street harassment is really multi-leveled and multifaceted. And what CAS does actually is a lot of street harassment, like cultural organizing, but we do bystander intervention workshops. And we talk about the fact that street harassment is so prevalent because people were not vigilant in looking out for each other. And being an active bystander is not something that's normalized in our culture. It's actually normalized for us to look away or not actually pay attention to it or think that somebody else is gonna take care of it. And so we teach folks how to intervene in street harassment and public harassment so that there is more folks who are more equipped to step in and say, something, even though, yes, there is, like Alana was saying, there are a lot of folks who may run the risk of, being harmed if they intervene, but it at least, can begin to shift the culture around how harassment happens.
Thank you. Walete?
I agree. And thank you so much, Jakendria, for just bringing up the fact that it's not always just in a situation where there's like attractiveness or other factors. It's yeah, your expression, your gender expression. If you present a certain sexuality and what that looks like, I think that's really important to note. For me, I think it's real. I know it's real, but I think it didn't dawn on me personally until my own experience with a friend was like, "Oh, like you're the nicest, you're the nicest person. Like the way you let people down is the nicest I've ever seen." Whenever like we were walking on campus, and I was like, it didn't even dawn on me that was like I was trying to like kind of safety plan in ways of like, all right, I don't want to have no problems. Like, let me just be like, hi, smile, and then be like, I'm really busy, and just we'll keep on walking. And I think that it's one of those things of it's so normalized in society. No one again, there's some books I've read where it was like a black girl who was getting having street harassment from an officer was actually getting street harassed, like there's street harassment from another male, and then they were like, hey, do you see that this person is doing this to me? And then the officer also was like, well, yeah. And it's like, all right, so what are is that point, what are we supposed to be doing? Like, it's not, obviously it's making me feel uncomfortable. And I think it's just something of like being respectful of people and being able to accept if somebody's not interested, no. And a lot of our society is like there's so much ego and so much just like it's hard for people to accept no. When someone says no, it's a very personal thing to you. It could be other things going on in their own life and they're just like no, but it's I don't know where that happens. And I think that that's something that we need to talk about in the upbringing of like respecting boundaries and being able to have those layers upheld where you can communicate something to someone or be communicated to, and you are able to hear it and move forward in the best way for you and the next person as well.
Thank you so much. Those are great responses. I appreciate you all sharing about some of the incidences wherein it turned even more violent, like it escalated. There have been several that I have read about and heard about on the news where, someone decided they didn't want to, they didn't like the advances or they rejected the person. No matter how they rejected them, there have been individuals that have been shot, killed, and the like. So, thank you for sharing that, sometimes it's not just a harassment. Sometimes this person, this is a life or death type situation. We did have one other question. We have been fortunate enough to weave in some of these great questions that the audience members have asked. Looks like I have one on statistics. It says, do any of you know where I can find stats reflecting how often or how many women of color have been victimized by domestic violence? Does anyone have good resources or different places that you think that folks should consider looking when they're going out, finding research and different information in the event they want to just be more knowledgeable or share writings? Thoughts, folks?
I responded.
Okay.
But it was the Women of Color Network, I think is a good place to start. WOCN.org. I think they have a lot of good statistics, not just about Black women. They have talk about Indigenous women, Asian Pacific Islander women. There's also some reports that come from the state. The federal government made some reports about like the state of Black women in America, the state of this type of woman in America that has a lot of statistics that you can look at that talks about interfamily violence, talks about community violence. So I think it's out there if you look for it. I think you can Google it and information comes up. It's not super hard to find, but I mean, I think Women of Color Network is a good place to start because that's what it's for, women of color who have been survivors of violence. That's what the organization is kind of based around, that whole topic. So that's just a good starting place. From there, you can get on other offers and other publications that you could go off on tangents and like explore those and research those as well.
Thank you so much. Anyone else have thoughts about places to consider? Okay. Well, It looks like we're done just a tad bit early. I want to thank you all on behalf of Ujima for this very lively and informative conversation. I really appreciate the information that you've had to share and your responses to the very important questions that were asked. We really appreciate you spending time with us this evening and sharing your great minds. Folks out in the audience, thank you so much for sharing space with Ujima this evening. We really appreciate the lively conversation in the chat. I'm hoping that my panelists here will drop their information to connect with you on social media, and if you would like to collaborate with them going forward in the future. Thank you all, and have a good evening.